served him twice. The first time was around 4:30 in the afternoon. 2 rum and cokes, card payment, a quiet thank you. Brian Hooker collected the drinks and walked back to wherever Lynette was sitting by the pool. The bar at the Abaco Inn was busy that Saturday, a full Caribbean afternoon crowd, the kind of energy that builds at a waterfront bar when the sun is still high and the weekend has nowhere to be. Ken moved to the next customer and didn't think twice. The second time was approximately 90 minutes later. Brian came back alone. The bar was even more crowded by then. The kind of Saturday evening at a Bahamian poolside bar that makes you move fast and keep the line moving. Brian looked at Ken across the bar and said something small, something that Ken has now put on the public record by name, in the New York Post and on Fox News. Because the morning after he heard it, he woke up, learned what had happened on that water, and found that the words would not leave him alone. He said, "Oh man, thank you for getting me served kind of quick." That was it. That was the last documented exchange between Ken and Brian Hooker before Lynette Hooker entered the water and did not come back. Ken is not an investigator. He is not a maritime expert. He is not a forensic analyst or a legal commentator or someone who has spent years studying cases like this one. He is a Bahamian man who has spent his entire life on and around the waters of Elbow Cay and the Sea of Abaco. He knows that geography the way you know the geography of the place you grew up in. He knows the distances between the islands. He knows what the water does in those conditions. He knows how long it takes a boat, any engine level, any set of conditions, to cover the crossings he has watched happen from behind that bar hundreds of times. And when Ken heard what Brian Hooker said happened in the 8 to 10 hours after those last 2 rum and cokes were poured, something in that local knowledge made him stop. Not because of the man he had observed across the bar, but because of the math. Because 4 miles in 8 to 10 hours, even drifting, even without an engine, even in rough conditions, does not match what Ken knows about how the Sea of Abaco works. That is where this investigation stands right now. In the gap between what a local bartender knows about 4 miles of water and what the official account requires those 4 miles to have taken. In the detail of a green cover-up that never made it into a single description given to the team searching the water for Lynette. In a timestamp that says 6:34, surveillance footage that says 6:38, and a statement to police that says 7:30. Welcome to True Crime Vault. Before we go any further, if you are watching this for the first time, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. This channel follows documented evidence, names every source, and stays with every case through every development. No speculation presented as fact, no accusations without a public record behind them. If that is what you are here for, subscribe and like this video. Drop your theory in the comments below. I want to know, which detail do you think investigators are focusing on most? The timestamp, the missing description of the green cover-up, or the 8 to 10 hours on 4 miles of water? Let me know. Now let's go through everything. Lynette Hooker was a Michigan woman in her mid-50s who had been around boats and water since childhood. Her mother, Darlene Hamlet, told the Associated Press directly, Lynette had been around lakes, boats, sailing, and swimming her entire life. Her daughter, Carly, told CBS News, "My mom is very fit and strong. She's a good swimmer. She can't just have fallen off the boat." For over a decade, Lynette and Brian documented their life at sea under the name The Sailing Hookers. Sea turtles and sunsets. Cinnamon rolls baked in a solar oven on the deck of a 55-foot sailboat they named Soulmate. A life built around the water, around each other, around a decision to trade the ordinary for something that looked from the outside like pure freedom. Lynette's last Instagram post was April 4th, 2026. The caption read, "Not going anywhere for a while." She had no idea. On the evening of April 4th, 2026, Lynette and Brian Hooker arrived at the Abaco Inn on Elbow Cay. Ken was behind the bar. He served them twice over the course of 2.5 hours. He never actually saw Lynette directly during that time. She had gone to the pool when Brian ordered the first round, and Brian came back alone for the second. Ken took the card payment. He heard the thank you for the fast service. He finished his shift and went home. And when he woke up the next morning and heard what had happened on the water the night before, something in him did not sit right. Not something about the man he had observed. Ken is clear about that. Brian seemed like a former soldier, quiet, polite, grateful for fast service. Nothing flagged, nothing stood out. Ken is not describing a man who behaved suspiciously in the hours before his wife disappeared. He is describing a man who ordered rum and cokes, said thank you, and left. What Ken is describing as strange is not the man at his bar. It is the math. 4 miles. That is the distance from where the alleged incident occurred near Elbow Cay to the Marsh Harbor Boatyard, where Brian arrived at approximately 4 in the morning on April 5th. Ken told Fox News directly, it's only 4 miles that way. It shouldn't have taken 8 to 10 hours to get there. Even if he was only floating, it should have been a much quicker time. Ken is not making an accusation when he says this. He is doing arithmetic with local knowledge. He knows those crossings. He has watched boats make them. He understands what the currents do in the Sea of Abaco, and what the winds do, and how a vessel, powered or unpowered, engine or drift, moves through those specific waters in those specific conditions. And 4 miles in 8 to 10 hours does not match what Ken knows about how that water works. Ken is not making an accusation when he says this. He is doing arithmetic with local knowledge. He knows those crossings. He has watched boats make them. He understands what the currents do in the Sea of Abaco and what the winds do and how a vessel, powered or unpowered, engine or drift, moves through those specific waters in those specific conditions. And 4 miles in 8 to 10 hours does not match what Ken knows about how that water works. Let's slow down here and explain what 4 miles on the Sea of Abaco actually means to someone who has spent their life on it, because that context matters enormously to understanding why Ken's reaction is significant. The Sea of Abaco is a body of water that locals know intimately. Its moods, its currents, its tidal patterns, the way the wind moves across it in different seasons and at different hours of the day. Ken has spent his entire life watching boats cross it. He has watched dinghies, sailboats, fishing vessels, and everything in between make crossings in every kind of condition the Abacos produce. He knows what rough looks like out there. He knows what drifting looks like. He knows what happens when an engine dies and someone has to paddle or wait for a current. And he knows that 4 miles, even in difficult conditions, even without power, even in an 8-foot dinghy, does not take 8 to 10 hours. That is not a theory about what happened on the water. That is a man from the Bahamas applying the geography he has lived inside for his entire life to a set of numbers that do not resolve the way they should. His conclusion is not that Brian Hooker did something specific or intended something specific. His conclusion is that the math is weird. That is his word. And in context, it is a precise word. Not wrong, not impossible, weird. The kind of thing that makes a person who knows the water stop and look at the numbers again. That is a bartender's observation. It is also, independently, an observation shared by at least 3 other people who were in direct contact with the events of that night from different vantage points. And when you lay those 3 observations next to each other, what emerges is not a theory. It is a convergence. Let's go through each one. Jim Todd is a volunteer with the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Service. He is a solid, respected member of a small island community where everyone knows each other and says so without exception. He was one of the first people to encounter Brian Hooker on the morning of April 5th. He helped bring Brian in from the shore at Marsh Harbor. He went back out on the fire and rescue vessel with Brian and with police. He stood on the bow of that boat with Brian Hooker for approximately 10 minutes, while Brian attempted to point out where Lynette went overboard. Jim was also at a restaurant with his wife and family on the evening of April 4th. He arrived just before 7:30 in the evening, and he has a specific memory of that evening that matters to this investigation. At approximately 7:30 to 7:45, Jim told investigative journalist Ashley Banfield the wind had kicked up to the point where it was unpleasant. It was getting dark. He would not have expected to see boats underway in those conditions. But at 6:38, when the surveillance footage shows Brian and Lynette heading toward the dock, Jim Todd confirmed something that directly addresses the center of Brian's account. At that time of year, in those waters, 6:38 p.m. on April 4th was not darkness. It was not dusk. It was daylight. Clear, full, unambiguous daylight. and it would remain daylight for another 45 minutes to an hour. Brian Hooker told authorities they left the Abaco Inn at approximately 7:30 in the evening. He described the conditions as too dark to see Lynette in the water after she went overboard. He described choppy seas and failing light as the factors that made rescue impossible. He said the darkness was why a former United States Marine could not locate his wife in the water near him. That darkness is the load-bearing element of his account. Without it, different questions require different answers. But hold those 3 timestamps together. 6:34, when the photograph was taken. 6:38, when the surveillance footage shows them heading for the dock. 7:30, what Brian told police. The gap between 6:38 and 7:30 is 52 minutes. Not a few minutes of imprecise memory. Not the kind of discrepancy that comes from someone trying to remember whether they left at 7:10 or 7:20. 52 minutes. And that 52 minutes does not exist in isolation. It connects directly to the core of why the account says rescue was impossible. If the departure was closer to 6:38 than to 7:30, the conditions Brian described, the darkness, the inability to see her, the failing light, did not exist at the moment he says they did. Jim Todd confirmed a 15-minute dinghy crossing from the Abaco Inn dock to where the Soulmate was anchored would place an incident happening around 6:50 to 6:55 p.m., squarely in complete daylight. Now let's add Ken's detail back into this, because it carries more weight alongside Jim Todd's observation than it does alone. Ken said 4 miles should not take 8 to 10 hours. Jim Todd said that at 6:38, there was full daylight and another 45 minutes of usable light ahead. Captain Bill, a licensed boat captain who was anchored directly beside the Soulmate that night with friends, whose account has been confirmed through multiple reporting outlets, said the weather in that area really wasn't that bad. That is not a general characterization of Bahamian conditions that evening. That is the specific assessment of the conditions in the specific area where the Soulmate was anchored, from someone who was there on the water and experienced those conditions directly. Brian described 3-foot seas, 18 to 22 knot winds, and darkness so complete he could not see his wife. Ken says 4 miles should not take 8 to 10 hours. Jim Todd says at 6:38 there was total daylight for another 45 minutes. Captain Bill's account says the conditions in that specific area weren't that bad. 3 people, 3 separate positions in relation to that evening. 3 observations that each, individually, might be explained or qualified in isolation. Together, they point toward the same gap in the arithmetic, and in the middle of all of it is a green cover-up that search and rescue never knew about. Let's spend time on this because Jim Todd's reaction when he learned about it is documented, on the record, and significant. On the morning of April 5th, standing on the bow of the fire and rescue vessel with Brian Hooker, Jim Todd asked Brian what Lynette was wearing when she went into the water. That question is not casual or procedural. In a search and rescue operation, the clothing description becomes the operational target. It goes into text messages. It goes to every team on the water. Every person scanning the surface for any floating material is looking for what that description told them to look for. The color, the garment type, the visibility of what a person in the water is wearing. That information is the difference between a search crew's eye stopping on something and passing over it. Brian Hooker's answer was consistent every time he was asked. A black 2-piece bathing suit. That is what he told Jim Todd. That is what went into the communication chain. That is what every team member on that water was looking for. A woman in a black 2-piece bathing suit. The photograph taken at 6:34 p.m., time-stamped, taken by a fisherman named Joe who had no connection to the Hookers and was photographing the environment for his mother, shows Lynette Hooker wearing a light green bathing suit cover-up, a green garment, clearly visible, worn over whatever she had underneath. The kind of thing that floats. The kind of color that stands out against dark water in a way that a black bathing suit simply does not. The kind of detail that if a search team knows about it, becomes the first thing their eyes are trained to find on the surface. Jim Todd found out about the green cover-up after his initial interview. His reaction, in his own words to Ashley Banfield, was that it profoundly changed how he felt about Brian's story. Those are his words. Profoundly changed. Take a moment with that. Jim Todd is a volunteer who works water rescues. He has seen people in crisis. He has seen the confusion and disorientation that genuine trauma produces. He extended Brian Hooker the professional courtesy of a person who has watched people process difficult nights on the water. The assumption that confusion is normal, that memory is imperfect, that shock produces gaps. He gave Brian the benefit of every doubt that his rescue experience had taught him to extend. And then he found out about the green cover-up. A green cover-up that was visible in a photograph taken at 6:34 p.m. A green cover-up that Lynette was wearing when she walked toward the dock at 6:38. A green cover-up that is, in every practical sense of the word, the single most important visual detail that search teams looking for a person in Bahamian water would want to know about. A green garment floats. A green garment on dark water at night or in low light is visible in a way that a black bathing suit is not. If search teams know about the green cover-up, it becomes the target. Every eye scanning every surface of that water is looking for green. Search teams were told to look for a black two-piece bathing suit. Brian Hooker denies all wrongdoing. His attorney has said so repeatedly and clearly. The missing detail may have a perfectly ordinary explanation. Shock, disorientation, the impossibility of processing everything coherently in the hours immediately after a traumatic event. These are real possibilities, and they deserve to be acknowledged. But Jim Todd's words are also in the record. The green cover-up profoundly changed how he felt about Brian's story. And Jim Todd is someone who spent 10 minutes standing on the bow of a rescue boat with Brian Hooker the next morning, watching him try to point to where his wife went into the water and hearing him say it was confusing, and he just couldn't be sure. The shore was 150 yards away. The soulmate was 1,000 yards in the other direction. In the water, 150 yards from land, you swim to the shore. There is no ambiguity in that choice. And a husband who watched his wife in that water the night before could not say, in full daylight the next morning, pointing at the visible shoreline, which direction she went. Jim Todd told Banfield that he initially assumed the confusion was intoxication. A man who had been through a terrible night, who had been drinking, who was exhausted. That assumption was reasonable. Then he learned that Brian had 2 drinks over 2.5 hours, and that Ken's assessment of Brian's condition when he left the bar was sober, functional, not noticeably impaired. Jim Todd's response to that is on the record. He said that absent intoxication and absent genuine panic, what a person in a boat does when their partner goes overboard in shallow water in daylight is instinctive and automatic. Brian Hooker has said publicly in his first interview after his release that he never harmed Lynette and never would harm Lynette, and that he wants to find her. His attorney, Terrell Butler, has stated categorically and unequivocally that Brian Hooker denies all wrongdoing. He has not been charged with any crime. The investigation remains active. Those facts are stated here clearly, without qualification, because they are part of the record and they matter. But they exist alongside the green cover-up that wasn't mentioned, alongside the 52-minute gap in the departure time, alongside Ken's 4 miles and 8 to 10 hours. Let's go back to Jim Todd on the bow of that rescue boat, because there is something else he put on the record that has not received the attention it deserves. When Brian tried to point out where Lynette went overboard, Jim pointed to 3 different spots on the nearby shoreline, each one clearly visible from the bow of the rescue boat, each one identifiable. Each one specific enough to give a person clear reference points for the direction their wife had been swimming. And Brian's response was the same each time. It was confusing. He just couldn't be sure. The shore was 150 yards away. In the water, at any time of day or night, 150 yards from shore is not a navigational ambiguity. You either swam toward land or you swam away from it. There is no third option. And the husband who was watching his wife in the water, in conditions he says were rough enough to make rescue impossible, could not say the next morning in full daylight, pointing at the actual geography of the incident, which direction she went. Jim Todd told Banfield that when he first encountered Brian that morning, he assumed the confusion was intoxication. A man who had been through a traumatic night, who had been drinking, who was exhausted and disoriented. That assumption felt reasonable in the moment. Then Jim learned that Brian had approximately 2 drinks over 2.5 hours, and that Ken, the bartender who had served him, described Brian's state when he left the Abaco Inn as sober. not noticeably impaired, functional. Jim Todd's response to that information is on the record. He said that absent intoxication and absent genuine panic, what a person in a boat does when their partner goes overboard in shallow water in daylight is instinctive and automatic. You throw the anchor. It is at your feet. It is large. You throw it and you hold your position, and you do not drift away from the person who has just gone into the water. The anchor was never deployed. There were 2 life jackets in the dinghy. Brian says he threw the green flotation cushion toward Lynette. But there was a second life jacket. You could throw it and get additional distance toward her. Or you put one on, take the other, and you go over the side. You are 150 yards from shore. You are a former United States Marine. You swim to her. You pull her toward land. You both get out of the water. You find the dinghy in the morning. The equipment was available. The capability was documented. The distance was manageable. None of it happened. Now let's take a step back from the specific details of April 4th and look at the broader context of who Lynette Hooker was. Because understanding her matters to understanding why the details that are missing from Brian's account matter as much as they do. Lynette was not someone who stumbled into the sailing life on a whim. She had been around water since childhood. Boats, lakes, swimming, the whole vocabulary of a life built close to water. She and Brian spent years working toward the sailing dream before they actually launched it. They sold their house. They searched for the right boat. They found it in Rockport, Texas, fixed it with their own hands, and pushed off into the Gulf of Mexico in 2023. By the time of her disappearance, she had been living aboard the Soulmate through Louisiana, Florida, and into the Bahamas. She knew those waters. She knew that boat. She knew that dinghy. She had made dozens of crossings just like the one on the night of April 4th. Her daughter Carly's words carry weight for exactly that reason. My mom is very fit and strong. She's a good swimmer. She can't just have fallen off the boat. That is not a daughter in denial. That is a daughter describing a woman with years of direct daily experience on small boats in open water. A woman who understood the mechanics of that 8-foot electric dinghy, who knew what choppy water felt like in it, who would not simply bounce over the side at 2 to 3 miles per hour. The physics do not support it. Her experience does not support it. The private record of the relationship between Lynette and Brian, separate from the public social media documentation of a life that looked joyful from the outside, shows something more complicated. There was a 2015 incident in Kentwood, Michigan, where police responded to an altercation involving both of them. Lynette told officers she had been choked. Brian was found with a swollen, bloody nose. Both alleged harm. Lynette was taken to jail for the night. The warrant against her was later denied. No charges were filed against either party. The couple separated multiple times during their more than 20-year marriage. Most recently, about a year and a half before the Bahamas trip, they reconciled and returned to the Soulmate. In 2022, Lynette sent a private text to a friend describing herself as wanting to leave, thinking about going to Florida, and then she wrote, "I gave up everything I worked for." The boat was their home. Leaving Brian meant leaving everything. No house, no land, no conventional path forward. Starting over in her mid-50s. That is a specific kind of constraint that is not just emotional, it is practical and financial, and it is documented in her own words. She stayed, she reconciled, she went back to the Soulmate, and on the evening of April 4th, 2026, she walked toward a dock in the Bahamas wearing a light green cover-up, and a stranger's camera caught her at 6:34 p.m. That is the last confirmed photograph of Lynette Hooker alive. Now let's look at where the investigation currently stands, because there are developments beyond the witness accounts that speak to the digital and forensic record investigators have been building since the beginning. And some of those developments are more specific than most coverage has explained. The devices seized from the Soulmate are being analyzed. A U.S. Coast Guard officer confirmed in a direct phone call to Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, that Apple Watch data from the vessel is being read. Let's explain what that means in practice, because the Apple Watch detail is one of the most significant forensic developments in this case, and it has been mentioned in coverage without being fully examined. An Apple Watch worn during the hours in question logs a continuous stream of data. Movement data, tracked at regular intervals through the accelerometer and gyroscope, creates a record of physical activity, whether the wearer was sitting, walking, running, performing physical exertion, or remaining stationary. Heart rate data is logged continuously, and the heart rate record across those hours produces a physiological timeline that can establish patterns of physical exertion or rest that are specific to the individual wearing the device. GPS position data, where enabled, logs location at regular intervals and produces a movement track that can be compared against other records. The AIS data from the vessel, the stated account, the documented departure and arrival times. If someone was wearing an Apple Watch during the evening of April 4th and into the early morning hours of April 5th, the watch produces a record of those hours that is not dependent on memory, not shaped by an account given to police, and not subject to the interpretive flexibility that verbal statements allow. It is a continuous digital log of physical data. Investigators have it. What it shows has not been made public. The AIS tracking data, the automatic identification system that logs vessel position at regular intervals, remains a central element of the evidentiary picture. Carly Aylesworth accessed that data and shared it with the U.S. Coast Guard. She saw the vessel's position at Elbow Cay in the evening and saw it move up the coast toward Marsh Harbor later that night. But she told investigators she could not account for what happened in the time between. The full AIS log, with entries at regular intervals throughout those 9 hours, is in the hands of federal investigators who are working it alongside the Apple Watch data, the physical evidence from the vessels, and the witness accounts. These are not isolated pieces. They are overlapping records of the same period of time, each one produced by a different system, each one capable of confirming or contradicting the others. Where they align, they build a picture. Where they conflict with the account given to police, they create the specific kind of evidentiary problem that leads to arrests on probable cause and, eventually, to charges. The Royal Bahamas Police Force Commissioner confirmed to NBC News that Brian Hooker remains a named suspect, who has not been cleared and can be rearrested. That is not a routine status designation. It is a formal investigative position that reflects the active and ongoing nature of a case that has not reached resolution. The U.S. Coast Guard criminal investigation remains open. Carly Aylesworth, Lynette's daughter, flew to the Bahamas to search for her mother. She walked the shorelines where the cadaver dogs had been working. She gave a formal statement to police. She sat on the dock and looked at the water and said out loud, to nobody who could hear her, "Hey Mom, I'm here, wherever you are." Darlene Hamlet is in her 70s and waiting for a phone call that has not come. She told Ashley Banfield, "I just want nothing more than to say I love you and wish you would have come home." Lynette Hooker called the ocean her happy place. She documented a decade of that love. Sea turtles and sunsets and cinnamon rolls baked in a solar oven, the particular radiance of someone who has found exactly where they belong. She was fit and strong, and she had been swimming since she was a child. On the evening of April 4th, 2026, a man named Ken poured her husband his last round of the night and heard, "Thank you for getting me served kind of quick." And 4 minutes after a stranger's camera caught Lynette in her green cover-up at 6:34 p.m., the surveillance footage at the Abaco Inn recorded 2 people walking toward the dock, and Brian Hooker told police they left at 7:30. 4 miles should not take 8 to 10 hours. Ken knows those waters, and the numbers do not resolve the way they should. The green cover-up never made it into a single description given to a single member of the team that searched for Lynette through that night. The anchor sat in the bottom of the dinghy and was never deployed. The second life jacket was never thrown. And a former United States Marine who describes being unable to reach his wife in the water managed to fall overboard himself 5 days later during a police operation and was pulled out safely while wearing a life vest. The investigation is active. The analysis is continuing. The forensic work on the devices seized from the soulmate is ongoing. The Apple Watch data is being read, and every documented detail, the timestamp, the surveillance footage, the 52-minute gap, the green cover-up, the 8 to 10 hours on 4 miles of water, the anchor that was never deployed, is part of the evidentiary record that 2 governments are building around this case. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. His attorney has stated that clearly and repeatedly. He denies all wrongdoing. Every individual referenced in this investigation is presumed innocent unless formally charged and convicted in a court of law. Nothing in this video is presented as a criminal accusation. If you have any information about the disappearance of Lynette Hooker, please contact the Royal Bahamas Police Force or the U.S. Coast Guard through their official channels. Both investigations remain active. Lynette Hooker deserves every question asked with honesty. She deserves the full weight of every documented detail followed completely to wherever it leads. She deserves the truth of what happened on that water on the night of April 4th, 2026. And Ken, standing behind his bar on a Saturday night in the Bahamas, pouring rum and cokes and hearing thank you for the fast service. Ken knows 4 miles. He knows those waters. And 4 miles in 8 to 10 hours is the kind of thing that, once you hear it from a man who has spent his life watching boats cross that water, you cannot unknow. Subscribe to True Crime Vault and turn on your notifications. We will be here for every development in the Lynette Hooker case, every hearing, every forensic finding, every piece of the record as it enters the public domain. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who has been following this case. The more attention stays on Lynette, the harder it is for this story to fade before the answers come. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What detail from this investigation do you think matters most to what comes next? I read every one. Lynette Hooker deserves to be found. Her family deserves the truth. True Crime Vault, unlocking the cases that deserve to be remembered.